in the Faculty of Economic Studies at the University of Athens. And of course, most notably, I think for this occasion, the former Minister of Finance of the Hellenic Republic, Greece. And I think it's fair to say, Yanis, that you had one of the most colourful and controversial tours of duty as a finance minister in the modern era. So what I'd like to do is open up the conversation, first of all, by going back to those very fateful 10 days or so in the last week of June and the first week of July last year, which really did make anybody who was paying attention make their head spin. Just to frame this a little bit for the audience, to remind you, when Syriza had come in, I think the program that was in place at the time, that was in January, had about a month to run, and you had a 4-month reprieve through to the end of June. And then just a few days before that deadline loomed, I guess the Eurogroup made a take it or leave it offer to Greece. And Mr. Tsipras surprised the world by calling a referendum. Various other things happened. I think the banks were closed, so it was pretty hairy stuff. For about 7 or 8 days later, that referendum was held, and there was a resounding no to the Eurogroup proposal. But then that very night, things took a big turn, about a 180-degree turn. Mr. Tsipras then announced that he was going to essentially negotiate with the Eurogroup with a view to accepting some kind of package, and at that point you resigned as the Minister of Finance. I think correct me if I'm wrong, more or less have that right. So I'd love to start by just getting your view on this. What was going on in that week or so, and how should we understand for the history books exactly what happened?
That 10-day period seemed to the outside world as if it was the moment of truth. It wasn't. Even before that 10-day period had begun, my heart had sunk. I knew that the cause was lost. It had been lost sometime in March, April. I can explain why. And we were going through the motions. I was hoping that a strong referendum result would energize my Prime Minister to pick up where we had left off, and I can explain what I mean by that. But in the end, well, the referendum result itself was a major surprise to me. My wife, Danai, who is here with us today, can confirm that on the afternoon of the referendum, I sat at my desk, and I penned my fourth letter of resignation on the assumption that we had lost the referendum, that the yes had won. And a few hours later, I found out that the incredible Greek people had voted 62%. Every single constituency in the land had voted no. And I just couldn't believe my eyes. And I thought that would hopefully re-energize our team, and the Prime Minister. He didn't. I walked into his office. He said, it's time to surrender. Just when the Greek people had backed us. And I tried for 3 hours to dissuade him. I failed, so I walked out and resigned. But this opportunity to address you and to have this discussion with you is precious to me because of the major disconnect between what was going on and what was being reported by the mainstream media, actually by all the media. Never before in my life had I imagined that it was possible to have such a gap, a chasm between reality and reported reality.
So would you like to amplify that? And maybe also you made some reference to the game was essentially up in March or so of last year, but continued right through to the dramatic events of the end of June, early July.
Allow me to just frame the discussion as succinctly as I can by saying that the problem began, for argument's sake, maybe it started in 1821 with the Greek Revolution. No, the problem began in 2010 when the Greek state went bankrupt. Well and truly, deeply, irreversibly insolvent. And the great and the good in Europe, that included the central bank, Chancellor Merkel, Wolfgang Schäuble, the president of the Commission, the president of the Eurogroup, the IMF, and the Greek governments, decided to treat a case of irreversible insolvency as a case of illiquidity, to pile upon the shoulders of the most bankrupt European nation that lacked a central bank to have its back. The largest loan in history on conditions that guaranteed to shrink nominal GDP. And that could never end well. It was a typical case of extending a crisis and pretending that it was solved. And of course, 9 months later, in 2011, 2012, there was a need for another extend and pretend loan, and then another one, and then another one. And the only reason why I accepted the challenge of doing something that I had never imagined I would ever do in my life, which is to go into politics, to run for parliament, only because the Prime Minister, the man who was going to be Prime Minister, invited me to be his finance minister, was because he and I had a simple agreement. I was not a member of the party, so I was an outsider within the party and within the Eurogroup. Not a very enviable position to be in. The agreement we had was very simple. We're not going to take another loan from European taxpayers until and unless the Greek private sector is stabilized. It's really very simple. No more extend and pretend, and we would go down in flames rather than sign on the dotted line of another such agreement. And the reason why I'm saying that the last 10 days was neither here nor there, really, was because from day one, well, actually, no, day 3, I moved into the ministry on the 27th of January. Prior to that, Tsipras and I had agreed that the moment the troika of lenders threatens us with bank closures, because it was clear that that's what they were going to do, and we had agreed on how we would retaliate if they did this.
Because they could basically cut you off, cut the Greek banks and banking system off from the euro system of settlements.
Well, the Eurozone is a remarkable set of institutions. We have a central bank without a state and states without a central bank. So there's nothing easier than closing down the banking system of one of those member states, where you've got, especially after the deleveraging and the credit crunch following 2008, you have a death dance between insolvent states and insolvent nation-state domiciled banks. And if the central bank cuts liquidity off or signals an intention to think about cutting liquidity off, it's finished. On the 3rd of December 2014, more than a month before our election, the central bank, through its representative in Greece, the governor of the Bank of Greece, which is of course part of the European system of central banks, did something unique in the history of central banking globally. He came out with a statement out of the blue, signaling his concern about the liquidity of the Greek banks. You know the story about the two men who meet at a golf club, and one of them says, I made my money by burning down my business and claiming the insurance. And the other one says, well, I had a similar experience, mine was flooded. And the first man asks him, how do you start a flood? In the case of, 3rd of December...
How do you start a run on the banking system?
Yeah, well, it's very simple. If the central bank announces the possibility of a liquidity crisis of the banks, that's it. It happens the next morning. So we had a bank run, a slow-burning bank run before we came in. And we knew that this was going to happen. And we knew, as it happened, 3rd day I was at the ministry, President Dijsselbloem of the Eurogroup visited me in my office. We had the warm-up meetings with all the aides and committees and all that. And then we had a tête-à-tête meeting, a bilateral meeting. Immediately, the first thing he said to me is, what do you intend to do with the existing program? Now, let me remind you, ladies and gentlemen, that the existing program was a fiscal consolidation program that was attached to the loans, which reduced nominal GDP by 28%, increased unemployment from 8 to 28%, ensured that there was no bank credit even to profitable firms, and effectively crashed the economy. So I said to him, look, Jeroen, this is a program that clearly has not worked, and the reason why I'm here, why I was elected, was because the Greek people have had enough with it. Now, at the same time, I understand that states have continuity, which means that we have a commitment to this program because previous governments have signed it. But in democracies, like Europe is a democracy, when there are two clashing principles, on the one hand, the principle of continuity, and on the other, the principle of rationality and democracy, What do? You find common ground. And he turned around and said, well, that won't work. If you insist on renegotiating this package, your banks will be closed on the 28th of February. That was on the 27th of January. So this was a clear clash that was engineered on the other side. And the only way of averting it, and this was our outside option, if you want, in game theoretical terms, or our leverage, we had a bunch of bonds, Greek government bonds, old Greek government bonds, that the ECB had purchased under Jean-Claude Trichet in 2011. And this was the last slice of debt, Greek debt, which was in Greek law. So it was not in US law, New York law, it was not in London law, it was in Greek law. So all I had to do was to sign, I didn't even have to take it through Parliament. I had the document ready, a ministerial decree to postpone payment of these bonds by 20 years. And that would be hugely detrimental to Mario Draghi's quantitative easing, because he had a major clash with Jens Weidmann, the president of the Bundesbank, who was taking him to the Constitutional Court of Germany for violating the charter of the ECB by doing QE. And the only way that QE was allowed to continue was the pledge by the president of the ECB that there would be no haircuts at all, no restructuring of any paper at all that the ECB ever buys, as if this is a credible promise. But nevertheless, especially in Europe. And if I restructure that paper, QE would be in trouble. So as long as we signaled to the other side that if you close down our banks, no unilateral threat, but if you close down our banks, then we will restructure that debt. This would be, in my estimation, sufficient to bring the two parties together to do what? To find a compromise. And unfortunately, and the reason why it was lost in March, April, members of my government signaled to Mario Draghi, don't worry about Varoufakis, we won't let him do it. So it was all finished by that.
That was your leverage. That was in game. You mentioned game theory. You're well known as an expert on game theory. I think you've written books, etc. And many people, I think, in the markets who knew this were looking at you and saying, well, the minister must be using game theory here. That was your leverage. You didn't mention another form of leverage that many people thought you had, which was the ultimate, if you like, threat, whether it was credible or not, of exiting the Eurozone. But it seemed that what happened there was you didn't have a lot of leverage there because some people in the Eurogroup were actually perhaps saying maybe Greece should leave the Eurozone. So did you get out-bluffed, or was that never something that you...
It was never a strategy of mine. And I'll tell you why. But let me touch upon the game theory. I spent 20, 25 years teaching game theory and researching game theory. And anyone who has ever been taught by me will confirm that my message to my students was, game theory is a wonderful edifice, aesthetic, mathematical model by which to train your mind, but do not confuse that which is interesting with that which is useful. And if you try to apply this in negotiations, in real life negotiations, either in the corporate world or in politics, then you are a danger to others and to yourself. So I'm clean on this. And actually I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times immediately after I became finance minister with the telling title, No Time for Games. Greece was a bankrupt state, still is. We did not have either the moral or the analytical reason to play games and call bluffs. My view was very simple. When you're bankrupt, you do not take another loan until you restructure your loans and your operation. This is what a bankruptcy lawyer in Wall Street will tell you. This is what any proper banker will tell you. It's not left, right, it's just common sense. And this is why I found myself in, it took a very deep crisis in Greece to create circumstances where somebody like me, I'm a left-winger, can say the same thing to a left-wing audience and to an audience of bankers and be met with agreement. So there was no bluffing. Now, given that there was not going to be any bluffing, I would never use Grexit as a tool, as a method for gaining leverage. Why? Because I didn't believe in Grexit. I don't believe in the euro. I think we should not have created it. I campaigned against it. But I also implore people, especially friends of mine and ideological friends of mine, to make the sharp distinction between static and dynamic analysis. It's one thing to say we should not have gotten in. It's a very different thing to say we should now get out. Because once you're in, the path that led you in does not exist for you to backtrack, to reverse upon. You'll fall off a cliff, to put it very bluntly. Go back to
you're
the
in a different part of the game tree now.
Exactly.
Can't go back.
And you can't go back. That's it. It's an irreversibility. Yeah?
So I'd like to bring the discussion.
Non-linearities.
I'd like to bring the discussion to the contemporary situation where the negotiations over that program, although it was announced and the European Stability Mechanism signed off on it, etc. The actual first review and to bring the IMF in particular back into the game is still going on. And the IMF position seems to be that a little bit, I guess, similar to yours, that they take issue with the debt sustainability analysis. On the other hand, the Eurogroup do not want anything that looks like a nominal haircut. And then you would have people who claim that the Greek government maybe has been dragging its feet on different reforms. So there seems to be still a stalemate, but seems to be getting closer to resolution if we take the recent few days. So that's my question.
Have you listened to the discussion between Paul Thompson and Delia Valculescu that was leaked by WikiLeaks? It's worth a listen.
I did
or a
listen
read.
to that.
It really is worth it.
I did listen to that. But what is your assessment of the situation on the ground now, the Greek economy? And is this Grexit risk? You may not want Grexit, but is the Grexit risk going to start to loom large again?
To understand what went wrong last year and the reason why my removal has not helped, you've got to understand that there is a major tussle between three basic forces, powerful forces. One is Dr. Wolfgang Schäuble. He's a force in himself. Then there is Merkel, a force in herself, and the two forces clash mercilessly over not just Greece, over the Eurozone. They have completely different views, and one of the tragedies of being a pipsqueak little country like Greece, whose population is suffering the ill effects of a Great Depression, is that you have to wait until the elephants stop tussling and trampling upon you. And then, of course, there's the IMF. There are different agendas here. The IMF is particularly incensed with itself for having allowed itself to get into the Greek program in 2010. They blame Strauss-Kahn. They should blame everyone in there. But nevertheless, they have violated their charter to be in there, because the IMF has no right to lend to an insolvent state. They lent to an insolvent state in 2010, then they lent again in 2012, and last year they consented once more. They didn't lend any money, but they played along with the extension and pretension. So they want to find a way out. First time I met Paul Thompson and Christine Lagarde, they were more radical than I am. I was struggling to find a balance between what was necessary to do with the Greek debt and what was politically palatable in Berlin in order to find an agreement, to be pragmatic about it. So knowing that a nominal haircut is political poison for the German leadership, I was not proposing one. I was proposing very straightforward debt swaps, things that financial engineering conjures up within 5 seconds. So we had a debt of 30 billion, that those bonds that I mentioned before with the ECB, spiky, short-term, nasty. Well, park them on the ESM. In other words, take a 30 billion loan from the ESM and give it to the central bank. Receive from the central bank the super profits that they made, because they, of course, purchased those bonds far below par. Put them in an escrow account. Don't give them to me. I don't trust myself. I'm Greek. Put them in an escrow account and have that escrow account repay the IMF for the next 2 years. It will be enough. So that way, and then tie up the repayment schedule to the ESM to nominal GDP growth, and with certain minimum levels of nominal GDP before you trigger the repayments. In the end, they took this proposal of mine and they applied it to Ukraine, not to Greece. Okay. Somebody benefited.
They kind of did half of it with the terming out of the debt, though, in this 86 billion package.
And the 86 billion, what did they do with the 86 billion? But they did none of this. What they did was they took another 86 billion from one pocket of the Troika and gave it to another. But there was no debt restructuring there.
But there has been terming out, lengthening of maturities,
No.
correct? No?
No, not now. There was in 2012. But still, the debt is absolutely unpayable, as the IMF says. So just to give you, let me give you an example of the situation we found ourselves in. It was just absolutely maddening. 25th of June was when, you mentioned it before, I was presented in the Eurogroup with the ultimatum. It was the first time I received a single sheet of A4 from the creditors. During those periods, those 5 months of negotiations, my office would give them constantly debt swap ideas about reforms, about a new IRS, independent of the ministry, asking for the help of the German finance ministry. All that, a lot of paper was going their way. I had received not one page of A4 from them. And the international, especially financial press, was reporting that we had no proposals and we were stalling. Okay. So the first piece of paper arrives 25th of June, right 5 days before the banks were meant to close. And I look at it. I was given 10 minutes prior to the Eurogroup meeting. Can you imagine it? It was 120 pages. I went through it very quickly with my team, 2 or 3 people, and I walked in there. I heard the views of the leaders of the institutions, and then I started unpicking it and asking them questions. So the first question went to the central bank. I said, I notice here that in your funding proposal, you're cannibalizing the bank recapitalization fund to use it to repay the ECB in the short term. And where will the recapitalization funding come from? And then the answer from Benoît Cœuré and Mario Draghi was, what we do, we will replenish this by means of a new loan from the ESM. And then I look at Wolfgang Schäuble, I said, Wolfgang, do you accept that? They are embedding a third program into the second program. To make the second program, to extend the second program, they are creating a new program, a new loan, and they are embedding in the second one. Can you pass this through the Bundestag? No, I cannot pass it through the Bundestag. There is no. And he started shouting at Draghi. The two of them nearly had a fist fight, seriously, in front of me. Then I asked...
I think you're making some breaking news here, Yanis.
Well, I'm not an insider. And that's why, as I said at the beginning, this is why I appreciate having this exchange, in order to go beyond appearances and beyond what was reported. Okay, so then I asked Christine, I said, I see here there is a DSA analysis, a debt sustainability analysis. Does this have the approval of the IMF? Because the way I look at it, the figures don't add up. And I can't believe that your staff in Washington, D.C. have approved it. She concurred, they haven't. And that the IMF is not backing those numbers. But then I said to her, so is this also an ultimatum from you? Is this an ultimatum from the Troika or only from the Commission? Does the IMF say to me that this is take it or leave it? And she had to say, yes, but we have to look again at the numbers. So what kind of ultimatum is this? So they started fighting amongst themselves, and Dijsselbloem, the president of the Eurogroup, interrupts it and says to me, again, you have to tell me now whether you're accepting it or not, and if you insist on renegotiating the numbers, it will be casus belli. Casus belli. I said, this is not a language that I understand, Mr. President, and in any case, I would like to ask the Secretariat whether the President of the Eurogroup has the authority to threaten a Minister of Finance with casus belli. There was a kerfuffle in the Secretariat. There was an adjournment of 10-20 minutes, and then there were phone calls being made. I was just watching that in a combination of amusement and horror. And then the Secretariat, somebody from the Secretariat said, Mr. Minister, we have to inform you that the Eurogroup is an informal meeting of finance ministers. It is not constituted in European law or treaty, and therefore it does not exist legally. So the president of the Eurogroup is at will to do what he wants. I mean, this is the situation we were facing.
And that's basically when the referendum got called.
And at that point, the prime minister said, okay, and I think he had a point there, even though we disagreed by that time we had very serious disagreements. But he had a point. Here is a piece of paper that Europe, organized, civilized Europe, is giving a small bankrupt nation and saying, take it or leave it. Now, I was not elected to have a clash with Europe. At the same time, I was not elected to accept a piece of paper that was not worth the paper it was written on from a funding, financial, fiscal reform point of view. So what do you do at that point as a responsible government? You take it to the Greek people and you say, well, here it is, study it, we will give you recommendations, the opposition parties can give you recommendations, the Troika can come to Greece and campaign in favor of that piece of paper, and you decide. At which point, I had finance ministers telling me, are you serious? You're going to ask voters to make complicated decisions about their future? I said, yes, it's democracy. It's a terrible system, as Winston Churchill said, but it's the best of all alternatives, isn't it? Do you know any better system? So, you know, that's how it went.
Greece has been in the news, obviously, the last, more than a few months for another issue, of course, which is that it is at the front line of the refugee crisis in Europe. What effect is this having on the Greek economy, the administrative capacity? You know, that has also, you know, always been a question mark in Greece. And how does this refugee crisis kind of change the calculus, if at all, of all of this stuff that we're talking about, which is still ongoing, trying to reach agreement about, you know, what to do with the Greek rescue package, etc.?
In a humane, well-functioning Europe, the two issues should be utterly independent. One has to do with our own terrible monetary architecture. This is a family feud, a mess. We should just find a way of correcting it, of fixing it. The second issue is a humanitarian issue. There are people who are knocking on your door in the middle of the night, drowning, wet, they've been shot at, they've been chased out of their homes by various vulgar armies. At that moment, what do? I think the best strategy and the best policy was articulated by a 90-year-old woman on Greek television a couple of weeks ago. She's a poor woman, somewhere in Idomeni, the Greek-Macedonian border. She has a farmhouse, she has a few sheep, she's poor. And there were about 7 or 8 migrants, refugees, that were loitering around her place and she was feeding them. And this television crew invades her property and shove a microphone in her face and say, why did you let them in? And she said, they were hungry. To me, that is the solution. You know, when somebody knocks on your door in the middle of the night, you do not do a cost-benefit analysis, and you don't mix this problem with whatever problems your household has. Europe has many problems, but this should be kept completely separate. Let me say that on the question of what kind of impact it had on Greece. By taking you back a few years, you know, when the Iron Curtain collapsed in 1991, is anyone familiar with the fact that 1 million refugees from the other side of the Iron Curtain came into Greece? 1 million. We have a small country of 10 million. So 10% of an influx within a few months. Half of Albania came to Greece. Literally, half of the population of Albania came to Greece. You know what happened? Nothing. They're still there. Their kids are some of my best students at the University of Athens. They have an impeccable Greek accent. I can't tell the difference between their accent and the accent of Greeks. I only notice their surname being different. Greece is a much stronger, much richer country as a result of this influx of migrants. Europe is rich enough, powerful enough, big enough to be able to deal with this without anyone noticing the problem. You can take half of them, put them outside of Glasgow. It's empty. The food would get better in Scotland. the reason why we have this xenophobic moral panic about the refugees is because the economic foundations of Europe are very brittle, and they are becoming more brittle by the day due to the inane handling of an inevitable crisis of a currency which was not meant to survive the trials and tribulations and shock waves of global capitalism.
Well, I think that might be an opportune point to actually go to our members. So I'd like to invite the members here to join the conversation. Remind you this is on the record. Could you indicate your interest in speaking? Wait for the microphone to come. Stand up if you wouldn't mind. So the gentleman out the back there, state your name and affiliation and just ask one very concise question, please.
I will. Minister Varoufakis, very, very interesting. I'm Ronald Tiersky from Amherst College. I'm not a banker, I'm not a hedge fund person. Looking back on it now, do you think it was a mistake for you to go into the government with all that happened, or do you think it was exactly the right thing to do?
It is true that if I knew how we would be divided and that the original pact we had was brittler than I thought, I might have thought twice about it. But having said that, with the benefit of hindsight, I'm pleased that I went in. Because not just for Greeks, Europeans today understand a lot better the problems of governance of the European Union as a result of having brought out to the open all these shenanigans that are taking place within. When I go to Germany, when I go to France, when I go to Spain, I come across people, citizens, very concerned Europeans who can see the disintegration of Europe and all the threats that this is bringing to their doorstep. And they are appreciative of the fact that now they understand the profound problems of governance. We've started something which will certainly prove beneficial in the sense that an understanding, a grasp of what goes on behind closed doors, especially when what goes on behind closed doors is simply a recapitulation of failed policies for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with economic rationality, humanism, or democracy. This is an important contribution, and I feel that I contributed something to it, even though we lost the battle.
That's a lady down here.
Thanks. I'm Lucy Commissar. I'm a journalist. The groups, individuals, EU representatives attacking Greece said in one area that Greece was not collecting the proper taxes that were due it from individuals, from business, corporations. Did you raise the question with them that countries such as France and the UK, Luxembourg, run tax havens where these businesses and individuals stash their money so that they don't pay taxes?
Well, I didn't have to because, you know, in Europe, the president of the European Commission was running the largest tax haven in the world. It's called Luxembourg. Yeah? So when once he said to me, he looked at me and he gave me a little lecture on tax collection. I said, really? But no, let me make this point. There is no doubt that we had a serious problem of tax evasion and even worse, tax immunity in Greece. Those in power managing to manipulate the system in such a way that they didn't have to pay tax. They didn't have to evade taxes because they didn't have to pay them. There is a chronic problem in Greece. I have to say that this has improved a great deal for sad reasons. The powers that be have already taken their money out long ago from Greece, and those who are left behind don't have a way of tax evading anymore. So the degree of tax evasion has been severely circumscribed of recent, but that's not for good reasons. But let me relate to you the most traumatic experience I've had, more traumatic than negotiations or anything of the sort. I saw my job for the 5 months I was in government, as effectively having two pillars. One was the negotiation, and the other was tax evasion. So from day one, I convened a working group for homing in on the major tax evaders. Yeah? So I put together two teams within the ministry, one from the equivalent of the IRS, and the other one from IT, because you've got to realize that through austerity cuts and so on, we didn't even have the personnel to go after the tax evaders in a way that it would happen here in the United States. So the way we did it was I lent very, very heavily upon the banks to get real-time data of all transactions within the country and without the country for the last 15, 20 years. That took 2-3 months and a lot of leaning on bankers to do it, but we got it. And then I thought it was a simple matter of creating an algorithmic system, software, that would compare all the transactions from tax file number to tax file number with tax returns. I had a lot of resistance from the Greek IRS, which I didn't control, not because it's independent, but because it was answerable directly to the troika of lenders. In any case, I banged a few heads, put together this working group. Preliminary results in late May of 2015 revealed more than 480,000 tax file numbers that had evaded more than $150,000. That is a lot of money for the small Greek state, and some of them it was millions. Yeah? And this group was going to come to its final findings in October of last year. And our idea was very simple. Once we had the final list, instead of going through the process of prosecuting and all that, we would just announce that this is what we've done, without any names at all, and we would say, okay, now here is a website, you can go there, you have a week to pay what you think you owe, and if you do, we will give you immunity from prosecution, and we will turn a blind eye. That was the plan. Now let me tell you that the greatest resistance to this came firstly from the oligarchs within Greece, who were connected to the Greek IRS, with great cover from the Troika. And this sounds a bit strange, but remember, during those months I was in office, the press, the Greek press, television, radio, newspapers, that is owned by the oligarchs, was completely and utterly in support of the Troika against me and against the Prime Minister. And they were getting some cover for it. Okay, 6th of July, I resign. 8th of July, the head of this working group calls me. I was no longer the minister, but I had appointed him, in tears, saying that the Troika is trying to disband the unit. 13th of August, the new memorandum of understanding was signed. My Prime Minister had capitulated. In it, it is stated clearly that this working group is disbanded and absorbed by the original IRS, which was doing nothing. So the Troika is the oligarchs and the tax evaders' best friend. It's very difficult to explain this to people.
Yes, okay, the lady at the table over here. Thank you.
Hello. Kay Bulwer, John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Thank you, sir, for your remarks. I would like, could you comment on the land registry system in Greece as conducive or not conducive for investment, given that land, whether
it will be conducive when it's finished. We started about 90 years ago, okay, and we're still trying to complete it. This is the sad story.
And what is the issue there with the land registry? What is the problem you're trying to solve?
Well, the problem is that we still. I'll tell you a personal experience. When my mother died, she left me a plot of land, and then when when my lawyer tried to look into the deeds and all that, it was discovered that it was impossible to pin down exactly what I own, and it goes back to the Ottoman Empire, the various disputes on delineating the plot of land, which is not worth anything anyway. So this is a very old land with very long memories of territorial disputes, and it's not a technical issue. The technical tools are there for completing the land registry. But when the technicians who are responsible for computerizing and digitizing the land registry hit on the wall of these long-lasting legal battles between clans and various different jurisdictions, because Greece was not liberated all in one go from the Ottoman Empire. Anyway, it's a mess. I'm not a lawyer, I don't understand it, but it is taking ages. And from an economic point of view, the problem with this is that it is very difficult to establish property rights and therefore to create markets that are efficient. This is the long and the short of it. But we are getting closer, I think, on this issue.
David. Sorry, over here. David Malpass.
Hi, David Malpass with Insima Global. Could you comment some on the pensions of public sector workers, including the military? And it's not just a problem of Greece or an issue. It applies to Puerto Rico, here to Illinois, even to New York State. How do you compare those needs, the needs of those pension commitments, to the creditor's needs within that kind of a debt restructuring? Thanks.
Excellent question. Thank you, sir. We have so many different problems with our pension system. Let me mention 2 or 3, just in brief. The first one is, we don't have a proper social security system in Greece, which unloads a lot of burdens onto the pension system. So in properly constructed democracies, liberal democracies, the separation of social security from pensions allows pension funds to be viable and solvent. So in Germany, here in the United States, if you're a 62-year-old unemployed worker in a Rust Belt, and it's very difficult for you to retrain, to find a job in the area, or to be retrained and to be sent to another state, you're coming close to retirement age anyway, you go on Social Security, and then at some point when you're 65, 66, 67, you get transferred to the pension fund. In places like Greece, and I suppose the same thing applies to Puerto Rico and various other states, less developed states, there is no Social Security. So the 62-year-old will either starve, or there will be political pressure to put him or her onto the pension system. And then the pension fund becomes decreasingly solvent. So that's one example. The second problem we had in Greece was in 2012, there was a haircut of Greek debt, but it was partial, and it hit pension funds. So it was called PSI, the private sector involvement, something like that, some euphemism. Europe is fantastic at euphemisms. It was a haircut of private sector debt that was not covered by the powers that be. So the banks lost a lot of money out of the government bonds that were haircut, but immediately they got a capital infusion from the bailouts. So they were made whole in the end. The pension funds were not. The pension funds lost 20 billion. That's a lot of money for a small country's pension funds. So immediately their capitalization was destroyed. And then the Troika comes in, the creditors, and they say, okay, so you need to cut pensions in order to balance the books of the pension funds. Yes, but you know, set aside the social justice issue, just forget about this. Just look at the economics of it. If you look at the macroeconomic impact, it adds to the debt deflationary cycle, because I'm going to give you a very startling statistic. 1 in 2 families have no working member in Greece as we speak. It's that bad. 1 in 2. And they survive on the basis of some small pension. If you reduce that pension in order to balance the books of the pension funds, you may balance the books of the pension funds in a very, very short run. But the multiplier effect, the negative multiplier effect of this pension reduction is massive. Small businesses will close in areas where it's the pensions that keep them alive. And these people will stop contributing to their pension funds, and the downward spiral proceeds. So this was what I was struggling to impress upon the good people at the IMF, the ECB, and the Commission, that they must not think in terms of pure accounting. They must think of the negative multiplier accelerator effects of what they do in order to balance books, which in the end never get balanced when you ignore the dynamic macroeconomic effects of what you're doing.
Sounds very Keynesian.
Well, it's common sense, isn't it?
No, well,
I mean, even Friedman would agree.
Keynes was a great economist.
But I think that Milton Friedman would agree with that.
Not
I don't think that Milton
No.
would disagree with that.
I think a lot of economists would agree with that. I'll come to you, Ben, but down that table there, yes.
Thank you very much, Shane Vallée from Soros. You talked about...
I know who you are.
We have a history.
We have a long history.
You talked about the past. If you could talk a bit about the future, because Europeans seems to be stuck between a rock and a hard place and between conflicting feelings. On one hand, they're terrified about leaving the euro, and you seem to be part of that. In part because I think Europeans believe in what you've described and sort of the dynamic of that. And at the same time, Europeans are increasingly disenchanted and worried about the EU, European institutions, and the lack of democracy. So you seem to need a new settlement to resolve these two views. And this new settlement seems to be very far away. In part because France and Germany, the two countries that should be instrumental in bringing this new settlement together, seem to be so far apart. So I know you've started a movement that tries to bring about this new settlement. Could you describe a bit how it would work, and could you tell us if you have hope that this new settlement can come before the next 10 years? Because it looks like we're trapped into a muddle-through scenario that could last forever.
Yeah.
And if I can sort of add to that question, the problems of the architecture in the European Union and the Eurozone in particular, of course, are well recognized even by the elites in Brussels and elsewhere, with the 4 Presidents report back in 2012 and then the 5 Presidents report in 2015, laying out a kind of long-term roadmap. So what do you make of that? And what would your vision be for ultimately what Europe, in some sense, would need to look like, architecture-wise, for it really to work and to fulfill its promise?
In Europe, we have 2 problems, and the 2 questions I just received highlight them. One is that we have created the gold standard in the middle of Europe. And as we know, the gold standard is pretty good during the good times, and it's pretty appalling during the bad times. We have a currency which is schizophrenic. On the one hand, it resembles a fixed exchange rate regime, where the only serious mechanism for adjustment during a crisis is exit. But then exit is catastrophic, because you don't have a peg to sever, like the peso-dollar peg, which you just sever overnight. Here you don't have a currency that has a peg with the euro to sever. You have to create one, and it takes 10, 12 months to create one. So it's like devaluing, but announcing you will do so 10, 12 months in advance. So that's the panic about the idea of getting out. So it's partly a fixed exchange rate regime, and then it's the same currency, without really being state money, because there is no state behind it, no federal state. So this is one problem. The second problem is that unlike the American government, unlike the British government, unlike the German government or the Greek government, the European Union, which operates like a government, is not really a government. What is it? Come to think of it, it was created in 1950 as a cartel. The first name of the European Union, let me remind you, was the European Community of Coal and Steel. It was a clear cartel, and Brussels was the administrators of the cartel. What does a cartel do? It manipulates prices, keeps them constant, stops antagonism and competition between the French coal producers and the Germans and the Dutch. And then steel, and then automakers, then they co-opted the French farmers by means of the Common Agricultural Policy. It was a simple attempt to bribe them to accept free trade on the basis that we will take a part of our oligopoly cartel profits and give them to you. Maybe I'm simplifying, but I don't think I'm simplifying too much. And the problem with an administration whose raison d'etre was to administer a cartel is, especially if you graft upon it a common currency, an apolitical money, which of course can't be apolitical, because there's nothing more political than the apolitical. the combination of a cartels administration and a monetary authority does not respond well, firstly, to crisis. It doesn't have the political legitimacy for handling the distribution of burdens during the downturn, and secondly, has a deep contempt for democracy. And I experienced that. Anybody who has been inside the belly of the beast in Brussels or Frankfurt knows that democracy is only something to be accepted in name, to be denied in substance. And this is terrible because why? It's highly problematic. Because democracy is not a luxury. The reason why we have democratic processes is because it is the only way of regulating crisis and regulating the fine balance between the economics and the political legitimacy which is necessary to carry a population along the path of difficult reform and adjustment and so on and so forth. So Europe is absolutely incapable of doing that. And this is where, after my resignation, I had a lot of pressure from people to create a new party. And I just couldn't bring myself to it. What was I to promise the Greek people? If they shoved the microphone in my face, I would say, okay, so what do you, why should I vote for you? And I would say the same things that I said a year before, when I was elected. And they would rightly ask me, so why didn't you do it the first time around? We had a very small window of opportunity in the context of the nation state, of a small nation state, to reboot this extend and pretend. Had we succeeded, I think we could have succeeded. It was not predetermined that we should fail. We were divided, this is why we failed. Had we succeeded, we might have rebooted the whole process in Europe, but we failed. That opportunity was lost. And then I started looking at Europe. We were going to France, we were going to Germany, and I could see genuine interest by the Germans, by the French, by the Italians, by the Spaniards, by the British now, to have this conversation that Europe has always denied itself. A conversation of what are the common threats that we're facing as Europeans and what can we do about it. It's a conversation we never had. The Five Presidents report does not deal with that. You know, when the United States has a major crisis, the United States is not perfect, right? But at least when you are facing an implosion here, like you did in 2008, 10 people got around the table, oval table, square table, and they asked the right question. How do we stop this crisis from consuming us? Do you know what the Europeans ask themselves when there is such a crisis? How can we pretend that the rules that we had designed can still be applied? It is not the same question. When your policy is motivated by the second question, you have a catastrophe. And the bad economic outcomes, because you've asked this question, lead to terrible politics, because you need increasing degrees of authoritarianism and decreasing democracy in order to keep applying them. And so there is this vicious circle. So some of us, in a utopian twist, decided to put together a pan-European democratic movement, the purpose of which is to have this conversation. Just begin by having this conversation. We call it DIEM, as in Carpe Diem, Democracy in Europe movement. We have now, within 2 months, hundreds and thousands of branches that have spontaneously emerged from Finland to Portugal and from Britain all the way to Turkey, actually, which is very reassuring for me. And will it succeed? Probably not. But it motivates us to wake up in the morning and do that which we think we must do as Europeans, who fear that the disintegration of Europe, this holy war between France and Germany, between East and West now, Hungary and Poland on the one hand, and Greece, Germany, and France on the other hand, Britain and the continent. This disintegration, the re-erection of borders, of electrified furnaces between Austria and Germany, for God's sakes, that this is creating a postmodern 1930s, which is going, from an economic point of view, going to create a deflationary shock in the middle of a continent which is already sick financially. And this is not going to augur well for the United States, for China, for Latin America. Europe has damaged the rest of the world very significantly in the past. It has the capacity and the inanity to do it again. So Europe is too important to be left to the Europeans, and certainly to its European 5 presidents and rulers in Brussels and so on, in exactly the same way that the Americans in the 1940s with Bretton Woods played a significant role in stabilizing the world by stabilizing Europe, I would very much welcome a participation of the United States in the stabilization and democratization of Europe. And I lament the fact that the current administration, and a lot more so the future administrations that seem to be coming out of the woodwork, are retreating from Europe.
Great time to turn to you, Ben.
Ben Steele, Council on Foreign Relations. This has been an extremely stimulating conversation, but I'd like to keep you on the issue of looking forward and specifically at Greece. You've understandably condemned the strategy of extend and pretend. But obviously the German government, Chancellor Merkel in particular, needs political cover with her public to go forward. She can't just say, okay, it's time for us to acknowledge we're never going to get paid back, here's the bill. Isn't there a way forward, perhaps, with some empathy on both sides, for an extend and pretend plus? That is, extending debt maturities further, extending debt holidays further, not only lowering interest rates to zero, but pegging them to the ECB's deposit rate, that is negative interest rates, as a way forward out of this crisis, again, with some goodwill. Could we not do it that way?
Well, if you look at a policy paper which I submitted to the German government and to the Troika on the 11th of May last year, it was actually a lot less radical than what you suggest. There was no haircut, not even at the level of net present value involved. It was those debt swaps that I was referring to. And it actually comprised 3 chapters. The first one was this sequence of debt swaps that would make it possible for the Greek debt to be sustainable with a 1.5% primary surplus ad infinitum. A target which is not too easy to achieve, but doable, and would not involve a self-perpetuating cycle between austerity and recession. Okay? So that was chapter 1. Chapter 2 was the medium-term fiscal policy, which was designed in such a way as to consolidate and to ameliorate for the 5-6 years of the depression. And the third part was the reforms. And we were proposing really brutal reforms. So wrenching out of my ministry the whole of the public revenues department and creating a genuinely autonomous, independent IRS modeled on the American IRS. We had proposals for reforming the product markets, particularly breaking down cartels, oligopolies. In Greece, for instance, let me just give you just one small example of what I mean. In the last 6 years, we've lost, as I said, 28% of nominal GDP. Wages came down by 42% in nominal terms. You can imagine what that is. Prices came down by 8%. Now, the only explanation of this is an increasing concentration ratio, increasing monopoly power, and cartelized product markets. So we were talking about breaking those down. We identified as major reforms the creation of a bad bank that would be partly funded by loans that we had already secured from the creditors, in order to create a market for non-performing loans, to cleanse a part of the tranches of the NPLs that were impeding the provision of credit to the productive and profitable firms. And finally, a development bank where we would transfer the remaining public assets of the state to be managed at an arm's length from politics, but within a public investment bank that would use the remaining public assets as collateral to create a homegrown investment fund, which in association with the European Investment Bank would restart the engine of investment growth. So and let me tell you, just so that you know, who the co-authors were of this, because that again signals something, and it helps ameliorate for this disconnect between reality and what was being reported. So co-authors, some of them you may know. Jeffrey Sachs was my right-hand person. We wrote this together. We were working night and day. Somebody called Larry Summers, maybe you've heard of him. Lord Lamont, former Chancellor of the Exchequer of John Major, not exactly a communist. And Thomas Mayer, the former chief economist of Deutsche Bank. So we presented this to the Troika and to the German government. Now, it was very painful. Not that they rejected it. They never rejected it. You know why? They never discussed it with us. They refused us the right to discuss it. The question is why? But it's a long question, maybe for another meeting.
I thank you very much. I think that is for another meeting because we have to roll this particular one to a close. But I'd like to thank Yanis Varoufakis very much for his presentation today. Thank you very much indeed.
Oh, yes. No, I don't want to.